Africa Center for Strategic Studies. He's a senior research scholar with the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland. Dr. Siegle holds a doctorate in international security and economic policy. He has written widely for leading policy journals and newspapers. His interests and research focus is on the relationship between democratic governance, development, and security. Welcome, Dr. Joseph Siegle.
Thanks very much, Ibrahim. Glad to be here.
Sure. Professor Nick Cheeseman is a political scientist and professor of democracy at the University of Birmingham. He is the founder of Democracy in Africa, a non-partisan website for breaking news analysis, the latest reviews and data on African politics. He is a multi-published author of several books centered on democracy and authoritarianism in Africa. Prominent among his publications is the book Democracy in Africa: Successes, Failures, and the Struggle for Political Reform. His interest and development focus is on African politics, democracy, and elections. Welcome, Professor Nick Cheeseman.
Thanks.
And of course, our very own Alexander C.R. Hammond, who is the director of the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity. He is a research associate at the Vincent Center at the University of Birmingham. He is also a free trade fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, a senior fellow at African Liberty, and a fellow at Epicenter. Alex's interests include writing about African development, economic freedom, global well-being, and British politics. Welcome, Alexander Hammond.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. It's good to see you again.
Sure, sir. And of course, I'm Ibrahim Anoba, managing editor of African Liberty and also the manager of the Writing Fellowship Program at African Liberty. So let's get started. First, it's so unfortunate that the world is at this point where we have to see one sovereign country attacking another sovereign country, which of course reminds us of the Cold War era and unfortunately the world wars as well. Hopefully it doesn't get that bad. But the concern here is about how this news or this development affects the continent of Africa. And as we've seen, one of the major talking points as regards this very conflict is how it's affecting food security on the continent. So we know that Africa exports if not most, like a significant portion of wheat and sunflower and maize from both countries. And since this war started, prices of these commodities have skyrocketed, which of course are exacerbating the already volatile prices of food across the continent of Africa. So let me start with Professor Cheeseman. How do we survive this scarcity, considering, as you know, recently there have been reports that a lot of African countries are experiencing an increasing number of percentage in terms of extreme poverty. How do we prevent this food insecurity from creating more poverty on the continent?
Well, first up, thanks so much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and in this great forum. So thank you very much, and great to be here with my fellow speakers. I think there's three sort of broad things perhaps we want to put on our agenda today, and perhaps different ones of the speakers will be better at speaking to different parts of the agenda. I think, one question we might want to look at a little bit is the question of Africa's support for Ukraine / people suggesting that it hasn't been as strong, or condemnation of Russia hasn't been as strong as it perhaps could have been. The second, as you say, is the impact of the Ukraine crisis on a range of different, very practical day-to-day issues in Africa, food availability, fuel prices, etc., being another. And the third is perhaps, what all this means for the future of democracy. Will we see a massive push for re-engagement with democracy promotion by Western states? Will that mean fresh funds for civil society groups and so on? And what will that mean for African authoritarian regimes? So maybe there's a sort of three-point agenda. To get to your very good question, which I think is really important, it is really important to look at the very practical economic consequences of this, particularly in West African my website, Democracy in Africa, just ran a great piece on the impact of this in West Africa. And there were a number of West African states where, 30% of fuel, 30% of grain is coming from Ukraine, Russia, which means that, the suspension of production in Ukraine, the increased cost of goods out of Russia, the increased price of oil is a sort of double whammy, increasing food and fuel prices at the same time, pushing up inflation, but also causing real hardship. And we already have recorded protests in at least 3 West African states of, transport groups, or, we might call them sort of trade unions / vigilante militia, transport gangs, however we want to frame, that sort of sector, but of them striking in protest at the high cost of fuel, which is making their businesses impossible. So we have a set of issues going on there that are very practical and very immediate. And we need to map that onto what was already happening. Even before the Ukraine crisis, we had a significant hunger issue in the Horn of Africa, East Africa. Major food shortages, major rainfalls, major drought. And one of the biggest challenges we have faced as an international community for the last 20 years. At the same time, we have a growing hunger situation in West Africa that predated what we're now seeing. So what's happening as a result of the Ukraine crisis is playing into existing crises in West Africa and the Horn of Africa. And I think one of the big risks and one of the things that I've been trying to say to people and an organization I'm a part of, Oxfam, has been saying to people is that it's really important that in the rush to respond to Ukraine, and we must and we should respond to Ukraine, but it's really important in the rush to do that, we don't do things like divert aid away from other humanitarian areas, such as Africa. Because if we do that, what we're actually going to do is contribute to the loss of life in Africa. And there are some pretty horrible projections starting to come through of the extent of loss of life that we could see in the west of Africa and the Horn of Africa if we don't see more money being directed to immediate famine relief efforts right now. So the question then I think that has, because our focus today is authoritarianism and democracy, the immediate impact of that, of course, is on people's lives, and we should never overlook that. But from the point of view of this event, of course, the question is, what does that then do? And I think there's 2 things that probably does, right? It probably acts as a destabilizing force on a number of West African and Eastern Horn of African governments, because we have people who are going to be going hungry, we have people who are going to be struggling to be able to get in their cars, but we also know that the rising cost of fuel increases the cost of everything else, especially in landlocked countries. So there's going to be a broader process of popular frustration. To some extent, people might be patient because they might recognize that the drivers of some of that are coming from outside of the country. But in countries where governments are already unpopular, or where we have governments heading to elections, the impact of that could be quite severe. Now, that's not going to be a pro-democratic force or a pro-authoritarian force. That's probably going to destabilize whichever government is in power. So is it possible that we will see another coup in a country where a military junta recognizes that rising food prices and mass riots and protests mean that there's a level of instability that might be seen to legitimize military intervention? Plausibly. Not in the countries that have histories of civilian rule, but in countries that have histories of military intervention where there's a big question mark about whether or not we might see military engagement in politics. This is the kind of context in which the military might move. But equally, is it plausible that we'll also see potentially some of the more authoritarian regimes in West Africa destabilized by their inability to respond to rising food and fuel prices? Yes, that's equally plausible. And one of the things we've seen over the last few years is that these pressures are played out in very different ways across the continent. So on the one hand, we've discussed, and many of you will have heard me or others talk about, the sort of democratic backsliding during COVID-19, the way in which that has had a negative impact, for example, on media freedoms and civil liberties in a number of countries. But of course, it's also true that some of the frustrations caused by COVID-19 and the pandemic played into the massive victories for opposition parties in Zambia and Malawi in the last few years, galvanizing civil society in opposition to ineffective, semi-authoritarian and corrupt governments. So what I'm trying to say is that the impact of this is going to be profound economically, socio-economically, and to some extent politically, but the implications politically are not easy to read. It's not simply going to be a democratizing force or an autocratizing force. It's going to be a destabilizing force for whoever's in power. The final thing I'll say, and then because we've got two great other speakers, I don't want to speak too long at the beginning, and hopefully it can be more of a conversation. But the final thing I'll say is that I'm slightly skeptical, about the extent to which Ukraine is genuinely going to result in a kind of seismic change in the way that African international relations operates. I can see there being a new pact on a sort of promotion of democracy signed by Western states. I can see increased funding going into that. I can see a renewed language around democracy promotion that could even potentially take us back rhetorically to the 1990s. But I'm not sure that's going to be matched with a seriousness and a level of funding and a willingness to engage in all parts of the world. My suspicion is that the greatest part of that investment will be in the parts of the world in which the security challenge is greatest, i.e. places like Ukraine, and that relatively little of that will actually reach the shores of sub-Saharan Africa. So my gambit would be that even if we see broader changes as a result of this and a broader sort of focus on democracy, I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to make too much of a difference to sub-Saharan Africa and to the sorts of policies that international regimes support in Africa over the next 5 to 10 years. And I say that because my suspicion is that although in some ways the lesson of this crisis should be that we should be concerned about authoritarian leaders everywhere, not just for what they do at home, but for what they do in their neighborhoods. And we could think about what African authoritarian leaders have done in the DRC in a similar way to what Putin is doing in Russia. But while that's really important, actually what tends to happen when there's a major crisis closer to home is that Europe and the United States tend to lose sight of the importance of sub-Saharan Africa and focus on that more proximate threat. And my suspicion is that that's going to be the overriding impact of this over the next few years. If we want evidence of that, the fact that a number of international relief committee organizations are telling us that aid is actively being diverted from African humanitarian crises to Ukraine right now is a pretty good indication of what we might expect to happen in the future and the risk, I think. And I think one of the things then, and I'll end on this, that there's a danger there, is that, one of the reasons we've seen some ambiguity, I think, in the African response to Ukraine is the perception of, Western hypocrisy and inconsistency, and is the sense that, they're being encouraged to join a conflict on the side of a set of powers who are not always systematically fighting for democracy around the world. And certainly in the conversations that I have, the West's position on a range of issues from Palestine to Yemen and beyond is often brought up as a question mark about the sincerity and consistency of Western policy. And I think one of the most dangerous things right now would be for the West to take its eye off the importance of the many issues happening in places like sub-Saharan Africa to, as it were, over-focus on Ukraine for a long period of time. Because what that will do is it will confirm to people around the world that the West doesn't actually treat all countries equally, and that will actually reinforce existing suspicions about their place in the global political economy. And those will undermine support for the kinds of policies that I think most of us on this call would want to see in terms of support for Ukraine and showing international solidarity. Right. So I'll end it there. Hopefully those were useful first few thoughts. I look forward to the comments of the other panelists and to coming back and responding to what they say in a minute. Thanks so much, Ibrahim.
Thanks. That's a very broad response, which brings together a lot of questions I was already going to pose, but I still want us to stay a little bit on the food insecurity angle. Alex, so you heard what Nick said about how this could potentially be a problem for already authoritarian governments across Africa. I mean, when people go to the street to protest these high prices in food, it could be a huge challenge for governments in across Africa to keep people off the streets, which of course could actually lead to even further political problems for these incumbents. So one of the questions I want to ask, Alex, is: do you agree with Nick about the aid angle to solving this food crisis across the continent, that we shouldn't really take away the need to give some aid to already volatile problems on the continent when we are just focusing on this issue in Ukraine? Do you agree with that, or do you have other comments on the food insecurity question?
Yeah, so I think before I get to the aid, it's just important to put into the food insecurity kind of into context. And I know Nick has figures that his organization has found or created I was looking at the UN earlier today in preparation for this, and I think it was in East Africa, about 90% of wheat imports come from Ukraine and Russia. And for Africa as a whole, it's about 80% of wheat imports come from just those two countries. And with the Black Sea blockaded and none or virtually no wheat leaving Ukraine, this creates a serious problem because about 60% of the wheat eaten in Africa is from outside the continent, and then 90% of that or 80% of that is from just Ukraine and Russia. And this has caused prices to balloon really. In Sudan, I read bread prices have doubled in less than a month. Sunflower oil in Ethiopia up 200%. And the Center for Global Development has estimated that the war in Ukraine could push more than 40 million people into extreme poverty in Africa. I think that figure might be a bit high, but that's still extremely substantial. And one of the lessons I think from this is we shouldn't necessarily give in to the protectionist idea that, oh, okay, because there's a crisis in Ukraine and Russia, that therefore we should be self-sufficient and rely on ourselves. If you're in a country that isn't great at producing wheat, you certainly shouldn't decide to try and put all your resources and especially taxpayer money into funding the growing of wheat. Instead, it's almost a case of more trade is needed. So there's as many trade links as possible to countries around the world. So if there is a disaster in one region of the world, it doesn't cause a domino effect in others. And I think we saw that during COVID fairly well, when some countries at the beginning of a crisis were struggling more harshly with COVID than others. You saw these trade supply chains shift to different regions, thanks to basically free trade deals and the interconnectedness of a global economy. And when it comes to aid, I think it's an interesting one because aid, it's very multifaceted. But if we're talking about aid from governments, government aid by almost definition is guided by government policy and geopolitical interests. That's always been the case ever since the first country started giving aid. And you can see that across the world. You look at the top recipients of aid, and there's normally quite a large geopolitical interest behind it. So while I agree that support going to Africa, and especially investment in Africa, should not decline due to the Ukrainian crisis, it's of course going to be the case that especially European and likely North American governments will divert some of the limited supplies they have to aid to Ukraine because it is guided by geopolitical interests. And I might be unpopular, but and someone could say against me, okay, but there's, I know, war in Syria, that the people there didn't get nearly as much aid as, say, the people in Ukraine are getting. And that's very sad. But it doesn't detract from the fact that geopolitically, a war between Ukraine and Russia has far more influence on Western Europe than, say, a war in Syria or a war in Mali, or a much smaller country much further away from home that doesn't have a giant superpower with nuclear weapons actively involved. But I'd be interested to hear both Nick's and Joseph's thoughts on that. But government aid is by definition guided by government policy and geopolitical interests. So it's not surprising that we see a diversion during this war.
Cool. So Dr. Siegle, I want to get your opinion on that same question, but if you can also comment on this, is it apparent skepticism among Africans that now that Russia is getting more isolated in the international community, is looking for more weaker countries to partner with, not only for votes in the international organization, but also for strategic cooperation. And now we're seeing greater interest from Russia in Africa. Do you think we should be worried about this new Russia incursion into the continent, or the potential of it? If you can kindly comment on that, in addition to the food security problem.
Sure. Thanks, Ibrahim. I think Nick and Alex have hit a lot on the food security issue. I would just throw in that, in terms of the analysis I've seen from the United Nations, most of those wheat and sunflower oil exports are concentrated in a handful of African countries, mostly in the Northeast. So countries like Libya, Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya. They're the ones who are going to feel this the most, that they are feeling this the most here in the short term. There are a few others out there. And I think what's really critical is helping them adjust with the supply chain issues here in the short to medium term. Over time, there'll be other markets, other supply opportunities that emerge, or substitutes that come up. And it's important to keep in mind that Africa as a whole had a better than our average harvest this past year. So it isn't that all supply disappeared on the continent. There's a lot of food there. And so it's a question, how can we accentuate the intra-African trade so that those food supplies get to the places that are needed. And I would just underscore a point Nick made, that this is happening on top of already a crisis. So Africa already at the end of 2021 was at a place where we were seeing record levels of acute food insecurity here, and in high levels of forced displacement. Over 30 million Africans were forcibly displaced. Most of these situations of acute food insecurity, Nigeria, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, DRC, they are places of conflict and places of in some cases, repressive government. So I think it does come back to a big focus of our discussion today, that bad governance, autocratic governance, is a source of a lot of instability. More than 8 of 10 of the people who are forcibly displaced originate in autocratically governed countries. And so there's a very direct link here between bad governance and vulnerability to conflict, vulnerability to food insecurity, even before this latest crisis with Ukraine came. Now, as to the second part of your question, what should we be making of potential Russian engagements in Africa? Well, Russia has been accelerating its engagements in Africa over the last couple of years, and it's been having quite a lot of influence. And I think what's distinctive and important to think about in this is Russia hasn't been engaging Africa in a traditional statecraft manner. It isn't investing, more in development assistance or trade or foreign direct investment. It isn't even investing in security cooperation. What it's doing, and what we've really seen it ramping up in, is use of asymmetric tools of influence. And by that, I mean, it has focused on the deployment of mercenaries, disinformation campaigns. We recently released a piece documenting there are 16 active Russian disinformation campaigns currently going on in the continent. Arms for resources, deals, election meddling, and all of this is wrapped up in a strategy of elite co-option. So it's Russia's often making these deals with vulnerable African leaders who are authoritarian and who lack domestic legitimacy, and therefore are seeking out some sort of external patron. And those are the places that Russia has had the most influence here in the last couple of years. So, their support for Sudan, support for Mali, engagement in many ways co-option in Central African Republic, its support for Khalifa Haftar in Libya. So Russia's made great inroads in those places, and it's has its eyes targeted on a number of other African countries. And so I think that that lack of legitimacy in certain African countries is a real vulnerability for Russian influence. And again, it's not through traditional means, which would be the prerogative of Russia and the respective African countries. It's really through these asymmetric tools. It's a form of co-option that is acting in the interest of Russia to expand its influence, and it's enhancing the stature of these individual leaders, but it's really to the detriment of citizens in those countries who don't necessarily support these leaders and are heading down a path of greater instability as a result.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we've seen this new dimension to Russia-Africa relations in the last few years, and people are just really worried about the military part of it. I mean, we've seen what is going on in Mali and how France is responding to that. It may not be in the best interest of both countries. I mean, France is kind of feeling insecure a little bit, and Mali is saying this is the only option it has. If France is isolated, it has to turn to Russia. But anyway, that's a very complicated side. But I want to read one comment from Bafana Dlamini. They say, I think Nick has really highlighted an important point with regards to the West's response to such issues, especially in Africa as well as the Middle East. But now this raises a question of the extent to which international organizations have power and authority, especially with regards to humanitarian issues that affect the globe as a whole, because not much impact is made by African and Middle East political instabilities to the global economy, like the Russia-Ukraine invasion. And I think this is a question for Alex, but before I read that question out, I want to get you guys' opinion on this idea that perhaps this is actually a good time for Africa to focus on the AfCFTA, the Intra-Africa Trade Program or initiative, as a means to fostering trade within the continent rather than looking to Europe or elsewhere for exports or imports. That a lot of these problems that arise from Ukraine war, Russia-Ukraine war can be ignored if there is an existing strong network of inter-Africa trade. But I want to get your opinion, Nick. Do you think this is actually right, that this is a good time to focus on the AfCFTA, which I think you will say yes, but if that's the case, how do you think we should be going about it? How do we think we should be factoring this crisis into our consideration of the AfCFTA on the continent? And I'll be glad if you can keep it like within a minute so we can move to Pacific as well.
Sorry, who's the question to?
You, Nick. I want to get your opinion of the AfCFTA. The idea that the AfCFTA can be a way out for Africa in future crisis.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that one. Maybe I'll let somebody else take that one on the panel.
Yeah, Alex has done a lot on this. So, Alex, do you want to talk on that?
Yeah, sure. I think in a way I'll be kind of repeating what I said earlier, in the sense that much more trade links are needed in order to ensure a crisis in one area doesn't have a spillover effect, a huge spillover effect, we should say. I think it can be as limited, be kept as contained as possible. But the African continental free trade area could be an incredible opportunity to do that. All estimates seem to indicate, if all states sign up and everything goes as planned, intra-African trade could more than double within a few years. And I think most of us know by now that intra-African trade as a percentage of exports is exceptionally low when compared to other regions. It's about 17% of African exports go to other African states. In Europe, it's more like 70%. In North America, it's more like in Asia, it's more like 60%, and in North America, about 50%. So it'd be a great way to increase that and also have a huge impact on poverty alleviation. It may or may not be correct, but the World Bank indicates as well, if progress continues as it is and all states do ratify it, out of 55 African Union states, about 41 have ratified it. But the World Bank says by 2035, so just 13 years from now, if it goes as planned, about 30 million people could be lifted from extreme poverty. Now that could be an overestimation, but even then, even if it's wrong by, even if it's only 10 million, that's an extremely high number of people. And as well, they predict it could add almost $500 billion to the continent's economy. And if you look on the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity's website, we've got tons of articles looking at the impact the free trade area could have in different sectors. We've got manufacturing, agriculture, democracy, even the impact it could have on people living, people who have left Africa living abroad and sending monies back. We'll have an article soon on different financial systems. So I think that's a kind of a good resource to go to see what sector you're interested in, but I'll keep it brief as that's what Ibrahim wanted.
Brilliant. So we got 2 more questions, but I think my colleague, Bright Ogundare, has a question for either Nick or Joe. You want to go ahead, Bright?
Okay. Thank you, Ibrahim, for the questions that have been asked and our panelists for doing justice to them. But my question goes to Nick. Now, over the years, there have been crises of secession in some African countries. Now, in Nigeria, we have the Biafra crisis. In Cameroon, there's an argument of the southern Cameroon, that is the English-speaking part of Cameroon, to actually secede from Cameroon. Now, when you look at one of the arguments that Putin has used to justify his invasion of Ukraine, it is that he's supporting the right to self-determination of the people of the region of Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, considering these 2 situations, what do you think that African countries can learn in the management of secession in relation to what happened between Russia and Ukraine?
Thanks for your question. I mean, it's a tricky one, right, to start with, because, we don't have in most African countries external foreign powers trying to agitate in quite the same way. We can think, of course, of countries like Rwanda, who have been heavily involved in the Democratic Republic of Congo in terms of sponsoring uprisings and militias. And of course, we've had a number of countries around the DRC involved in that country for many years. But it's relatively rare for those to actually explicitly advocate a form of secession or assimilation in quite the way that Russia is doing. And it's even rarer for them to explicitly invade rather than to support proxy armies over the border. So it's quite a radically different situation to what we see there. I think, the broader point I think that is interesting for me is that if we are consistent as an international community, then we should respond to this by saying that this kind of interference across borders is illegitimate, and therefore it's illegitimate when we see it elsewhere. And we should therefore take greater steps to punish governments or to at least challenge governments who do this, right? And one of the things that has happened in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 15, 20 years is that countries have tended to turn a blind eye to when states do this. Of course, Rwanda was ultimately held up after UN investigations, and aid was suspended, and there was pressure there for Rwanda to change its policy in the DRC. But we do see kind of consistent intervention across borders in ways that can be quite destabilizing, and of course in ways that support smuggling. And a more efficient and effective and systematic policy to try and push that back would be a very good thing for all states. And so that's perhaps somewhere where we as an international community need to look. In terms of how governments actually go about managing their domestic populations, I mean, one of the things that we know, a bit of harmony with what Alex was saying before, is that, what you want to do in order to try and manage those tensions is to have effective nation building processes which integrate people both economically and ideologically in the idea of a common national identity. And we've seen leaders who've done that effectively in different African states. For example, think about Zambia, which of course did have some secessionist activity in a part of the country. Think about somewhere like Tanzania, where leaders like Kenneth Kaunda and Julius Nyerere pushed over a long period of time for a more coherent national identity underpinned by a strong set of unifying symbols that brought people together. But at the same time, I think, as well as recognizing the importance of language and the importance of the positioning of the government, it's important to integrate people economically, because when you strengthen that economic integration, so for example, roads, transport, networks, but also jobs, economic opportunities, you give people economic as well as ideological ones to feel part of the state and therefore to be happy to remain in the state. I think the significant issues that we've seen, let me take an example of Biafra in Nigeria, and then I'll hand over to others. You know, what we see there is a twofold problem, right? We see on the one hand an economic crisis in the country, which means that it's more and more difficult to use funds to keep people co-opted and to keep people feeling part of the state. And at the same time, we see a heavy-handed response from the central government, which has focused less on demonstrating unity and national coherence and more on a kind of militarized, more hardline security response. And the danger of that is that if those two things happen at the same time, you can considerably exacerbate and polarize support, and you can end up actually strengthening some of the hardline support behind the secessionist movement rather than actually dampening it down. So I think there's multiple lessons that we can learn, both from Africa's past and to some extent what we see in Ukraine, Russia, and from current experiences in countries like Nigeria. But these things are extremely difficult to manage, right? And they'll remain difficult to manage. And one of the things, you know, that I was talking about at the beginning is the way that current challenges are increasing the challenges of governance across sub-Saharan Africa and indeed the world. And I think these sorts of issues are exactly the kinds of ones that are likely to become more difficult to manage when we see economic decline, food shortages, and generally speaking, citizens start to think that the next year is going to be worse than this year. And I think if you look at sort of Afrobarometer surveys and others, there's now quite a lot of pessimism about the prospects for the next 12 months.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Now, I want to hear the thoughts of Joe on a very important part of what has played out in the Ukraine-Russian crisis, which is the issue of sanctions. Now, during the week, there have been reports of the fact that the ruble, which is the Russian official currency, is soaring, and then the fact that Russia is benefiting economically from the supply of gas to European countries. Now, it's caused into a question of how viable imposition of sanctions are. Now, over time, Africans have tended to appeal to Western countries to impose sanctions on authoritarian African leaders. For example, in Nigeria, anytime we feel that the current government is infringing on human rights, we go to the American embassy, to the EU office for them to lead the protest so that they can impose sanctions on these leaders. Now, but it seems as if the sanctions is not working on Russia. Now, what does this say about the imposition of sanctions on erring African authoritarians? Does sanctions still remain a viable means of bringing authoritarian leaders in Africa under control? I want to hear your thoughts on that, Joe.
Sure, Bright. Thank you. I think it's a really important question and one that we're going to be having to examine and grapple with here moving forward. I think the invasion in Ukraine has taken the whole reality of the use of sanctions as a tool to a whole new level. And there are going to be a lot of lessons that we draw from this. I would, I have a different interpretation of what's happening though, because I think the sanctions on Russia are having an impact. They're squeezing Russia very heavily, and it's causing Russia to have to make far more adjustments than I think it anticipated in its financial systems and its supply networks. And so it has directly constrained Vladimir Putin, and it is going to continue to do so. So I think it's a very powerful lever on their activity. Now, they're not going to acknowledge that. And in fact, part of the posturing is how autonomous they are. And certainly Russia's going to try to evade those sanctions. But it doesn't escape the fact that it's having a very damaging impact on Russia, and will continue to do so. And so I think, your question really, to me, or the way I think it's going to be framed is, look at the West can do when they really want to send a message to authoritarian government. And why can't we see more robust sanctions on African authoritarian leaders who, violate term limits, who, conduct coups, who are engaged in human rights abuses? Why can't we put more pressure? And I think that is the question that, we're going to be facing and should be facing. Because in the end, these authoritarian regimes are very resilient. They're going to cling to, power because, their political power is tied to their economic power, and they're going to be very reluctant to let go. And, sanctions is not the one and only action that's needed, but it's a potent one. And we've seen in Sudan with the sanctions there, we've seen with the sanctions in Mali, these regimes are, are always complaining about the effects, and they're blaming the sanctions for the problems that they're facing. And so they do have an impact. I think, the argument often is, well, sanctions also hurt the average citizen, and they need to be more, focused sanctions. And I'm all for, freezing assets and trying to make the individual leaders and their regime supporters feel most of that pain. But in the end, this is about both external pressure and domestic pressure. And when there are sanctions, it does heighten the reality that these regimes are bringing lots of economic pain to their countrymen. And so the fact that sanctions aggravate, the economic, activities in these countries simply is heightening the pressure and the tensions that citizens are already facing. And so I think sanctions actually work both ways. I think they serve a useful external pressure tool, as well as helping to extenuate domestic pressure, especially in these places where the political platform for citizens to speak up and push back is limited. And so I think they're going to be an even more important tool moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Thank you. You really brought a new angle to the discussion on sanctions. But however, I'll be handing over to Ibrahim for the continuation of the questions.
Thank you, Bright. Good questions, and thank you, Joe, Nick, and Alex for asking those questions. So I do have I think about 4 or 5 questions from attendees, and I want us to run over them real quick, run through them rather. So the first question will be to Alex, and this is from Osman Ali. If you could answer them within 2 minutes, Alex. Osman is saying, "It is me, Osman Ali. You mentioned Sudan, and as we know, authoritarianism regime in Sudan ruled for the last 60 years with no mercy for the Sudanese people whatsoever. I'm a victim of this regime in Darfur, currently living in Israel. How countries like Sudan can be moved from authoritarianism to a democracy regime? How do you think that war crimes can be solved, given that Sudan is greatly influenced by Russia?" Fascinating question.
Well, thank you so much, Osman, for that. And I'm sorry to hear about your situation, but I'm glad you're somewhere safe. I'm really glad you asked this question, because in preparation for this webinar, I was looking through I was watching an interview from our late friend and colleague, George Ayeti. and he had the best answer for this. So I'm not even going to answer, I'm going to quote him. And I think I'm doing so because it will open up a new kind of debate or discussion I think might be productive. So Professor Ayeti said, disassembling a dictatorship first requires intellectual reform, a push for freedom of expression and media. Second, political reform, democratic pluralism, free and fair elections. Third, constitutional reform, limiting the powers of the executive. Fourth, institutional reform, independent judiciary, electoral commission, etc. And then fifth, economic reform or liberalization. George said, most disastrous for Africa was economic liberalization ahead of all other types of reform. Economic liberalization engenders prosperity, but dictators never level any playing field. They implement only the types of reforms that benefit themselves, their families, their cronies. End of quote. And I think that's interesting because we have seen in the last 20, 30 years, microeconomic reforms in Africa have been fairly good. If we look at ease of doing business, economic freedom of the world, it's certainly not perfect, but there has been a rise in most things. However, if we then look at, say, Freedom House, the number of free countries in Africa, there's 7 of them. Most of them are clustered in Southern Africa or islands, and that's the lowest figure since 1991. So there's not been a lot of institutional reform. And now the hope has always been, I feel, for many decades is, okay, we can have economic liberalization, the middle class get rich, and then they can put pressure on the political classes in order to then implement decent decent political reforms. However, there's a worry we're not seeing that. And indeed, Africa as a whole, it's a completely different beast, but could be compared to China in that regard. We see them become so much richer, but the political reforms have lagged behind. So in a way, I'd actually be really interested to hear what Nick and Joe have to say on this. What should come first? Should economic reforms, is it okay if they happen first, then political reforms follow? Or is it necessary political reforms come first and then we can enjoy economic prosperity later? Because perhaps Botswana, one of Africa's success stories, shows good political institutions first and then economic success rather than vice versa.
Right. Yeah, so Nick, I wanted to respond to that question from Alex, but also to this question from an anonymous attendee who is pretty much asking about perhaps it's high time for African countries to explore like gas or oil reserve to see if we can cut our dependence on Russian oil. Nick.
Yeah, I mean, self-sufficiency in energy is something that I think will be a big focus around the world in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So that's definitely something that we're going to see. Of course, as the Nigerian experience tells us, finding oil isn't necessarily a great boon to the economy or to self-sustainability. It depends on having a strong, economic and political infrastructure to be able to manage that resource effectively in the first place. And that takes me perhaps a nice segue to Alex's point and the question that he threw up at the end. I mean, the analysis that I've done, and I think Joe's done some work that reflects similarly, is that generally speaking, there's some very good authoritarian performers and there's some very bad democratic performers when it comes to development and the economy. But if you look broadly, and most of the quantitative cross-national analysis that we've seen over the last 5 years supports this, if you look broadly, democracies outperform authoritarian states in Africa on 3 key things. 1, on corruption, 2, on economic growth, and 3, on key aspects of development expenditure, a good example being healthcare and education. And I think the reason that happens is because some of the things that we often associate as being, good about authoritarian development, so ability to take a long-term focus, short-term sacrifices for long-term goals, ability to build strong national infrastructure and so on, the things that we might associate with China and the Asian tigers and that authoritarian development model that comes out of kind of modernization and is about basically having strong top-down control so you can really set your long-term goals and achieve them and not be diverted away. That kind of state doesn't tend to exist in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't see authoritarian states with those characteristics. So what seems to happen more in sub-Saharan Africa is that when we take away horizontal or vertical accountability, in other words, where we don't have strong legislatures, where we don't have elections, where governments don't have to face the public, what we don't get is governments that say, right, we're now going to use this freedom to focus on 60 years of economic growth, turning us into middle income or upper income nations and building our infrastructure. Instead, we tend to get poor political monopolies that generate corrupt political economic systems that then undermine the opportunity for long-term economic growth.
Right.
So we can all point at a couple of examples that don't follow that. We could say Rwanda has done well with its economy, but Rwanda's pretty much the only one, right? It's pretty much one example of an authoritarian state anyone can ever point to that's done a really good job on most of this. Most authoritarian states are actually at the bottom of the pile. And generally what we find is that authoritarian states have a bigger range, a couple that do very well, a lot that do much worse, and democracies tend to perform in a sort of thinner band. In other words, there's fewer democracies that are performing exceptionally and getting sort of 12% economic growth every year, but there's way fewer that are doing really badly. And on average, the democracies perform better. So my argument in general is that in the African context, and I do think we might want to break this down and not have global sort of hypotheses and theories, but really think about the types of states and types of elites we have in different parts of the world, that in the African context, the authoritarian advantages that we expected to see in places like China and Asia don't apply. And that actually democracy in Africa has distinctive advantages over and above what it has elsewhere in the world, even though in some cases it hasn't been seen to perform as well as we would have liked. And the final thing I'll say, of course, is that it's also true that we have some good evidence now that authoritarian regimes also can't be trusted on their economic figures. The cost of doing business and other reports have actually been pulled due to corruption. But we also see, for example, a recent academic publication which suggests that authoritarian regimes misjudge and inflate their economic growth to a significant extent, and the information and figures they provide to organizations like the World Bank to a significant extent more than democracies.
Right.
So my broader argument is probably the best way we're going to get African states to have sustainable, inclusive development that actually, is meaningful over a longer period of time, is to foster democracy and economic growth / development simultaneously. We can't put off the democracy because actually the democracy is one of the things that's going to safeguard the economic gains.
Right. Sadly, democracy is it's a complicated thing in Africa, and it's not really black and white, but we really have to safeguard, as you said, Nick. But we're really rapidly running out of time, but we got like up to 6 questions still waiting, and I would like for us to run through them even faster, perhaps in a minute each. So Joe, perhaps you want to help answer this question from Bafana Dlamini. They say, how can commerce between and within African regions improve political stability between and within African countries? Because I think economic relations can create room for diplomatic measures when hostilities arise in Africa. I think you already touched on that a little bit. Perhaps you want to take a few some seconds to add some comments as well.
Yeah, let me jump in, and it in some ways segues onto the points that Alex and Nick were making. Yes, in addition to enhancing better economic growth and development, and this is an area I've done quite a lot of work on over the years, and it's very consistent really over the decades that even among poor countries and even within Africa, democracies do better across a host of development and economic indicators. And they also tend to be more stable. And so they're less prone to conflict. They're less prone to hyperinflation. They're less prone to severe contractions in their economies. They're less prone to human rights abuses and refugee outflows and internally displaced problems. And so, it's an important point. Democracies help bring stability. Stability helps with economic growth and prosperity. And really, when we're thinking about this bigger question, we're really talking about the political economy of development and the political economy of security. And what is a government's system other than a means of trying to identify whose interests are at stake and who's get considered? And that in its essence is what we're talking about. With democracies, the idea is to try to be more inclusive, try to be, considering more points of view, create more checks and balances, so those interests are considered. That tends to have a developmental benefit. It tends to be more stabilizing. Authoritarian systems, they rely on a smaller band of supporters to stay in power. Mm-hmm. And so the interests that they're focused on generating are for those that, that very narrow group of political supporters, and that's where the economic benefits go. So that's why you see more inequality. That's why you see higher levels of instability. So absolutely, I think we should be thinking. We want to be giving more attention to democracy as a means for enhancing development, and as a means for fostering stability. The 16 conflicts we see in Africa today, 12 are in authoritarian leading countries. So there's a pretty strong pattern there, if we look at it both in the present and historically.
You're absolutely right. Authoritarian regimes seems to be more very guilty when it comes to creating chaos for the economy, as we've seen in the case of Zimbabwe and elsewhere. But there are still questions about what is the proper democracy for African countries. And I think the question of young Soko speaks to that as well. And Alex, I'll be glad if you can take that in a minute. So Soko says that the war in Ukraine will have a devastating effect on African regimes because of the economic upheavals connected to the conflict. Is this healthy particularly for African democracies, or should democracy be reformulated to ensure it is not threatened by external factors in Africa? Alex?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I'd say it's an interesting one. I'd say it's very hard to have a democracy that is completely immune to external factors, because we live in an extremely globalized world, so therefore it's kind of expected that problems in one area, especially if they're as severe as the war in Ukraine, kind of melt into other areas of the globe. But I guess I would say, because the question was, is this healthy, or should African democracies reformulate to ensure it's not threatened? I don't think it would be healthy to reformulate so you wouldn't be threatened by any external events, because then you'll completely isolate yourself from the globe. And if I understood the question correctly, you'd then have to pursue the path of self-sufficiency. And indeed, you could argue, okay, maybe not necessarily self-sufficiency, but you could have the African continental free trade area and rely solely on other African states. Again, I don't think that would be my preference, just because then what happens if there's a huge, say, drought across all of Africa, and then the harvests are very poor that year for those countries, and you can't import or export or import from abroad. I think it's kind of just a way of life, in the sense that disasters happen in various regions, but to try and shield yourself from that doesn't work, because when a disaster happens in your country, you'll be suffering far more than otherwise.
Great. Unfortunately, we do not have time to answer the remaining questions. We still have about 4 or 5 questions, but I would like if each of you could kindly drop your email if you're open to that, so folks can ask you a question, or you can just drop your Twitter handle so they can also reach out to you on that channel as well. So I just want to thank you for coming to discuss this very important topic. It's certainly a discussion that should go more than an hour, because there are just a lot of questions to answer. But also thank you to each of the attendees for playing their part, and to my colleagues, Bright, Ogundare, and Anna,